I would first say some thanks to people who helped to make this show. First to Arne Reinhardt, who has built the walls. First time we have some walls in here, and he's done really an incredible job. Then to Jens Verstraeten, who was always kind of helping here and there, and especially for the technique. I mean, I don't know how to actually switch on the monitor or whatever, so he's been really helpful. And he has this fantastic show outside, when you see between the columns and the vestibule. Then Susanne Moore, she can't be here today, but I want to thank her too, because she was doing all the Instagram stuff, social media, but she also wrote where you say request for funding. We got funding first time here. That was successful thanks to Susanne. And then that means also thanks to the Bezirksamt Lichtenberg for the funding. And that funding was for the talk and for the exhibition. So then what is you see, like we announced 3 people on the panel. We have only 2 male here sitting. That's too bad, because Leigh Claire La Berge, she had to cancel this morning for family reasons. That's really sad, because I started to read some stuff that she had written. It's really interesting. I was very excited to hear something from her today, so it's really sad this way. Then just a few words to introduce the 2 men on the panel. Max Haiven. He teaches and does research at the Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. And he published several books. I think most known is the Palm Oil, the Crises of Empire. And then he did several books, and one about revenge capitalism, which I would really like to read too. It's kind of really interesting thought. Yeah, and then Mark, he is calls himself, I think, right, the active researcher, based in Berlin and Dublin. His multimedia installations, as we are in one of them here, they are informed by visual anthropology, and this is when, for me, it's kind of a key to understand this exhibition. And he has undertaken several acclaimed projects like Southern Cross, Breathing Factory, or Extracts from Eden. Mark teaches at the Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Dublin, and what I want to point out, amongst all the other biographical things, is that in the 80s he worked as an activist in South Africa against apartheid. And also he worked with young people from native communities in Alberta, Canada. So that's my tiny little introduction, and I leave it to you. Thank you.
If I may, and I know Mika has a short introduction and thanks, and just before we get into it, I just also wanted to say personally, this wouldn't have happened. There's been sort of personal circumstance ongoing, and so this installation you see here wouldn't have happened without Mikael, with Arno and Jens, working late into the night, sleeping here to get this done last week. So I just also want to say really heartfelt thanks, because I really thought this wasn't going to happen. So I really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all your hard work. And also the audience, Mona and Elias, who's painted till 2 in the morning, and we were here on Friday night. So I want to say thank you, and also to Gwen for putting up with a partner who wasn't there because he was sleeping here to get this done. So there's been a lot of work, a lot of labor put into this installation. So I just want to really like to acknowledge that. I'm also very sorry that Leigh Claire can't be here because of the situation we learned of this morning. If I can just say, because we actually were publishing this book together by Jean Marino, who's the curator of the ICA in Miami, also as an Irish person, right? So English is a tool. It's not my mother language, but also when I get excited, I can speak too quickly. Jens mentioned this to me. So I just want to say, if I start speaking too quickly, please interrupt. I won't take it personally. I know we've just met. But please just interrupt if I start spieling too quickly. So, but what the world and how these things operate, so we were incorporated into, or included in this book, and actually Leigh Claire's chapter on questions around capital and abstraction is next to extracts from the project you see here. So there was this coming together in the bound of a book from 4 years ago that I was kind of curious about, how these serendipitous things happen. I agree, it's unfortunate, and I hope maybe there'll be another opportunity. I am very happy that Max can be here, Max Haiven. Max, I really came across, and I should also mention his partner, I could say Cassie Thornton's work, when I was researching for this project. Because Max was one of those few voices in this world of ours that was looking at really around sort of ideas of hard practice, the relationship to the questions around financialization, global capital, global finance, and spoke to that resonated when one is trying to work through something and trying to make sense of the world while having questions, are you completely off your head doing this thing? Here was somebody that in some ways anchored some of those ideas, gave a sense of concreteness to some of those ideas. So I'm really happy that we're able to do this. What we're hoping to do is maybe talk, if we can, if we don't run out of things, for like maybe 20, 30 minutes or so, and then we hope to open it out. I think both of us probably agree it becomes interesting when we have a discussion and it becomes more discursive. So, making sure I haven't forgotten anything, notes that I made earlier, very random notes. The word that came to me was, as I was thinking about what we were going to do, was the notion of key words. I find key words really useful, and sometimes I'm trying to make just single words. And so I had key words thinking about Max's writing and Leigh Claire's, and I thought that maybe we could sort of pivot on that a little bit in terms of a discussion around some of the ideas that come out of this project. So it's funny Michael mentioned about revenge capitalism. So just before we'd said that maybe we could begin hold that tangent. I sat with this man at a cafe in Kreuzberg probably about 5 years ago, and he handed me one book, which is what we thought about today, which was The Radical Imagination, which is a beautifully edited book, which I also highly recommend. Also in terms of its aspirations and pragmatism of the people that are included, and the framework that both Max and Alex provide to it. And equally then, Max handed me a shorter piece, Vagabonds, about the notion of revenge. So I thought we'd begin today. Max, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your thinking on the ideas of when we think about, if I use the word capital, because Marx never used the word capitalism when he wrote, he used that word capital. In the context of capital, the notion of revenge, and what you're thinking about, or what you mean, if that makes sense. If you don't mean that.
Sure. I can talk a little bit about that project. And that project came out of many years of being an activist in anti-capitalist movements and anti-war movements and anti-racist movements in Canada and elsewhere. And also doing research for my PhD dissertation, which eventually would come out in a book around finance and financialization. And just being met with the incredible, unaccountable violence of the capitalist system. And the fact that people who have committed what Engels called social murder have never been punished and never will be punished. Like the CEO who orders the poisoning of an entire river system. That person's living happily, while the millions of people have been poisoned. And we just see this again and again and again, that there's this kind of cycle after cycle of vicious impunity. So on a very real level, the book was about trying to grapple with a very particular emotion, which is a kind of vengefulness that comes from living within a system of utter impunity. I think that's a feeling that many humans have felt over human history, but I think it has a very particular characteristic within capitalism, and I wanted to explore that as part of an effort, I think, of a lot of artists and scholars and thinkers to really grapple with what Chan Nagai calls like bad feelings. The feelings we're not supposed to feel, and yet we do feel. So the project went in a couple of different ways. One of them was that I wanted to talk about feelings of vengefulness against capitalism and how we could move from what I characterize as sort of like harmless revenge fantasies that kind of maintain reality towards what I end up calling an avenging imaginary, which would be some sort of more collective abolitionist idea of a kind of capsizing and transformation of the system, and using those feelings of revenge for something that's perhaps a little bit more constructive. While at the same time, I'm not against more destructive forms of revenge, just to be clear. And so that was part of the effort of the book. Part of the effort of the book was also to say that our ideas of revenge have actually been shaped by capitalism as well. So it was a kind of discursive piece to say, like, you know, like obviously revenge is a human drama. It's been with us since. Actually, there's a lot of evidence that other primates take revenge on each other, then even other animals that aren't primates have different forms of revenge. But certainly as long as there have been humans, and humans have been telling stories, and the stories have been recorded or passed down, there's stories of revenge. They're in the Bible, they're in every cosmology. So it's not a new thing. But I guess what I was trying to suggest is that every culture has different ways of making sense of and building a structure of value around revenge. And I suggested in the book that capitalism shapes our understanding of revenge in a very individualistic way. So we get, like, I don't know, the films of Quentin Tarantino, which are incredibly popular, or like Game of Thrones, which was basically just 7 or 8 seasons of people taking revenge on each other. These are very capitalist ideas of revenge that then don't allow us to see two other dimensions of revenge. One of them would be like, what does it mean when a group or a people take revenge, and as a means of transformation? And the other, and this is the kind of other part of the book, is to say, well, maybe it's not just individual humans who take revenge, maybe systems can take revenge. And if systems can take revenge, what kind of revenge is capitalism taking on us, on humanity? And the final thing I guess I would say about the book for now is just that, like, it was partly an attempt also to account for the way, one of the things I've been worried about that's come out of my teaching, and also engagements, is that, I mean, everyone's increasingly aware that there's a massive crisis that capitalism is creating, but people, because of the way that we've been habituated to certain kinds of narrative, we are always looking for, like, the guilty culprit. We're always looking for the villain. We're always looking for, like, the James Bond enemy who we can name. And one of the big problems over the last 40 years of neoliberalism is we've generally, across society, lost the ability to explain how things can emerge from systems that nobody necessarily intends. And so I wanted to create an account of how a system could take revenge, even though nobody within the system really intends it. So an example would be climate change. Like, nobody's like, there's no cackling villain. I mean, there's some people who are actually profiting from climate change, as we know, but they're not, they're sort of like, well, I'm gonna take advantage of a situation. They're not like, ha ha ha, I'm gonna fry all these losers and take all the, get all the money. Most people just sort of throw up their hands and say, well, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just gonna continue to do what I do. And so I think the idea of revenge was a kind of an attempt to account for that.
And can I ask just then maybe specific just on that? You mentioned that idea, but because it would seem to me the potential is probably in sort of group movements.
Yeah.
So in the book, I'm not having read the book, but you are there examples you can point to in terms of group equity?
Well, one of the arguments in the book is that if you have a movement that is truly trying to overturn a system, which is to say a truly revolutionary movement, it will always be called a movement of revenge, because the people who have discursive power within the society that they're trying to overturn obviously can't understand why anyone would want to overturn that system. So, if you go back to, like, the turn of feudalism to capitalism, and you would talk to, like, the aristocracy at the time, And like, why are these peasants rising up? The aristocracy would be like, well, they're pathologically vengeful. They're just demons, essentially. They're completely uncontrollable. So from the perspective of people in power, when powerless people rise up, that's always just revenge. Because within their cosmology, the power that they hold is legitimate, and their exercise of power is correct. I think we see that, and part of the account of the book is to say we see it again and again with the way that the powerful label the powerless as vengeful. Sometimes they are vengeful.
Yeah, of course.
And sometimes perhaps for good reasons. The book dwells with, for instance, like the Haitian Revolution, which is extremely vengeful, but C.L.R. James famously said of it that when it's remembered as it should be remembered, it will actually be the long-standing tolerance of the Haitians for what was done to them rather than their momentary sort of surge of violence during the revolution. So the book, in some ways, is more of a theoretical account rather than a kind of practical account, like this movement is good, this movement is bad, this is vengeful, this is avenging. It sort of tries to open the door for a theorization of that. Yeah. I think in the end, maybe a lot of movements are a bit of both. Yeah. Sometimes they're suffused with revenge fantasy, and sometimes they transcend that to this kind of avenging imaginary.
Or it's immersed in embodied.
Yeah.
I think part of me is thinking that we're getting ahead, because part of it, I think, our starting point, if we can be so bold, is that we're saying capital is unsustainable. So from scientists who, whatever, are pointing out, besides those who have theorized for centuries about the unsustainability. Yesterday I was listening again to James Baldwin in Berkeley in 1974, and he's already talked, this system is doomed, and he then goes on to, we're all trying to save our children, right? And asked the question from the floor of the UC in Berkeley. So I think this is our starting point. So today is really to think about, also strategizing about those other possibilities. And so maybe with that in mind, in terms of thinking about embodied revenge.
Yeah, fine.
That maybe we'll step back a bit and we will return to this sort of ideas about the notions of, again, revenge and other motives around what other possibilities may exist and exist around us as the clock ticks, I'm talking metaphorically. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because I guess part of that is also literacy, and no doubt I've even witnessed in projects doing this where I've made presentations. So in 2015, you'd mention the word algorithm, and you'd have to ask a little bit people if people knew what an algorithm was. And even in 2015, maybe half the group would put up and wouldn't know really what an algorithm was, and now pretty much I can assume everybody knows what now. So ideas of literacy. But if we use the word, then a word like financialization, would you be okay to sort of give me a sense of what you understand as financialization, and why it's sort of a key part of this system that we find ourselves in?
Yeah,
I would argue it is, if that's okay.
I think financialization is a term that I feel critics have increasingly drawn on over the last 40 years. Roughly the same time period that we usually refer to as like neoliberalism, as a way of describing the increased power and influence of the financial sector of the economy. And the financial sector of the economy is often usefully summarized by the acronym FIRE, which stands for sort of high finance, like big banks and investment banks and hedge funds and private equity firms. These sort of like big money corporations. That's the F. Then I is the insurance industry, which is actually much bigger than we might imagine. It's not just like insurance for your home, but also people who sell financial insurance, reinsurers. They basically create an infrastructure through which the financial economy can operate. And then the R and the E in the acronym FIRE stands for real estate, which we all encounter every day as a financialized service. When, for instance, it's almost impossible for anyone to get a home to rent in Berlin, or any of the other millions of gentrifying zones around the world, because it's basically been gobbled up by speculation, people not seeking to actually live in homes, but to make them. So the acronym FIRE describes this kind of financial sector, and then financialization, the way I've come to kind of define it in a nutshell, is like what most people talk about when they're talking about that is just a very purely economic idea, which is that over the last 40 years especially, and also at various moments throughout capitalism's history, you get the incredible power of this FIRE sector, which not only just grows in wealth, but actually grows in influence as well. So you have something like, the classic example is like General Motors, the American car firm. At a certain point around 1970s or 1980s, that company started to make more from its financial division than it did from actually exploiting its workers to make cars. And you likewise have all of these corporations that are increasingly taken over by shareholder activists whose main concern isn't that the company should be making something, like making drugs or making house building materials or providing services to the elderly, but that the purpose of all of these corporations, which determine many of the things in our lives, should be based on returning shareholder value. So that's kind of the economic side, but then there's a couple of other sides to financialization, which I think is really important to keep in mind and is illuminated by your work too. So you have then also the political side of financialization, which is probably best summarized by the fact that almost every finance minister of every government somewhere in the world is the alumni of a major investment bank, right? And it's not just, I mean, there's a kind of right-wing conspiracy theory that everyone's working for the Rothschilds, and that's, I think, a bogus way of thinking about it. But what is certainly true is that they share a worldview. And their worldview is that, the purpose of government is to enable corporations to make as much money as possible. And you should cut taxes and make life easier for transnational corporations. And that's the global consensus. Beyond that, there's also a sense that governments shouldn't just pay for the things they need by taxing corporations, let alone by printing money, but they should borrow money from financial markets and basically place governments at the behest of financial markets. So it's the political side. And then there's also a sociological and a cultural side as well, which is that like everything in society increasingly becomes financialized. So, the example I always give is constantly my students at university are told that they should invest in themselves. I mean, at what point did we decide that one of the most important aspects of human life, being the transfer of knowledge, skills, and development from one generation to another, should be framed entirely within the language of markets that promote horrifying forms of individualism? At a certain point, we were told that we should think about housing not as a place you live that is sort of part of society, but that you should invest in order to make a return at some point in the future. So the financialization also refers to this way that financial ideas, norms, codes, values trickle down, to borrow their metaphor, into the very fabric of society and really actually change the way we think about ourselves and our relationship to one another.
Okay, thank you. No, I am unbiased. This is really recorded and somebody watches this later, so I'm biased in what you're saying. But there becomes a point where, do I go with that point? Yeah, maybe I'll come back to that. You can remind me there was a point. But, so for me, there's the role of anthropology, if I can interject, and I'm thinking of capital as a cultural system. So having started as a social worker, gone back and studied photography, that I realized that photographs on their own weren't enough in the telling, didn't do enough on its own in the telling. And so if you think about it, if you think in a very basic, simple term, anthropology is a study of culture. And for me, then it's just visual media anthropology, so doing that through visual and media ways. And so to think of capital as a cultural system in and of itself, regardless if somebody is from Ireland or Ethiopia, or from Germany in terms of working in that system, but the culture of its system itself. And and to try and understand that in terms of actually, as part of plotting, in terms of thinking of a system that we know where it's leading, in some ways how we co-opt, transform, go beyond, and an understanding of that culture is critical. So you mentioned too the notion of the revolving door. So Leigh Claire would have referenced, and was a big reference for me too, was an anthropologist, Karen Ho, who did a long-term study of Wall Street. She was a former investment banker and went back and studied this culture. This was also a big reference point for my own work. And she talks about the ideas of the revolving door as a cultural part of the culture. So somebody is a minister of finance, they become, then an advisor to BlackRock, to Goldman Sachs. So one of the installations is George Osborne, who quit then as Chancellor in the United Kingdom and then doing a day a month at BlackRock, and in terms of and how these systems work. A great example is Mario Draghi, so a former Goldman Sachs banker who helped, and it's official, cook the books for Greece to join the euro, and then became the head of the ECB. That's not slander, that's actually a record. And then inhibited looking at what had happened around the process with Greece, and then became then the more recent leader in Italy. So this notions of actually the revolving door, or indeed Christine Lagarde, who was the Minister of Finance in France, then went on to head the IMF, was actually then brought into a court in Paris in 2018, in December 2018, and was convicted of a crime, of criminal act, as Minister of Finance in France under the former French Prime Minister.
Hollande?
No, not Hollande, before him. Sarkozy.
Yeah.
And was convicted. So was in the court, convicted of a crime, and walked straight out and back into her job as the head of the IMF, and she's now the head of the ECB. So the European Central Bank, and the process around this. So the cultural norms become very important of actually the functioning of the system. So I know for myself, if I was to be convicted of a criminal act, I most likely would lose my job, as I would imagine anybody who is employed, if you were convicted of a criminal act of such negligence, you would lose your job. So this is, and I mean this in cultural terms, in terms of the cultural understandings of the culture of the system. And this is something I describe as the normalization of deviance. So that deviance is normalized repeatedly in the system through the regulations of this system. And something that's seen as normal is repeatedly seen as normal till it becomes irreversible and catastrophic. And so this may come, and you look at me as also maybe left-leaning, and Marxist informed. But in 2015, as Misha knows, I sat down on a chair in the middle of Canary Wharf, trying to negotiate with a senior banker to participate in this project. And so I had made sort of contact first through email, phone calls, going to visit, showing some of the work I'd done to that point. And he became the first person to use the term. So he said, I will give this some thought about whether both I contribute, in some cases anonymously, or also to make a portrait. And you know, as he was leaving, I just said, well, how do you see the future of this system that you're a part of? And he said, no, it's catastrophic. If this system continues, it will be catastrophic for us all. And then he left, and I was to wait and get an email. Now, ultimately, in the end, he decided it was better not to be seen or heard at this time or at this moment. So the idea of those with outside this system somehow or another saying accusations of the unsustainability, that it is common knowledge in terms of those who work. This is the other thing I think is very much clear to make explicit, that within this system, and while looking for isolated figures that somehow did inside trading, I would argue at this stage, having studied this system intensely for 20 odd years, that the system is about inside trading. The system is about inside information. This is how it operates. And increasingly put regulation, its means to navigate the regulation. The shadow banking system, so maybe 80% of the money that circulates the world every day goes beyond the spectre or the realm of regulation, beyond the scope of any regulator in any country to sort of operate, to in many ways control. So I think that's where these cultural norms and understandings are very, very important, including this idea of the revolving door, which we repeatedly see. So that's a long interjection there, Max. Yeah, so I guess thinking a little bit about that, thinking about that notion of financialization. So one thing you may want to, because you did mention, and this is something that's a subtext in the thing, particularly on this, over here on the projection, the traders, is the notion of printing money, quantitative easing. So maybe it might be important to just maybe define what that is and what's been happening maybe the last 10 years in terms of since the
So with quantitative easing in particular?
Yeah. Even what we saw in the United Kingdom last week in one day.
I mean,
did the bailout ever end? This is the question.
No, it never really ended. I mean, interest rates are now going up again, so the situation is shifting. But yeah, I mean, essentially quantitative easing. But I mean, the vernacular way of saying it is that the government's basically just printing money and handing it out. But it's not quite, and handing it out to banks. And the idea here would be that and I'm making it conversational. So is that in moments of economic hardship, the economy threatens to grind to a halt. And financial institutions get jittery and then they stop lending. And if they stop lending, there's no new businesses, there's no new ventures, and the economy continues to contract. So according to a variety of different schools of economic thought that are dominant now, if you're in a moment of economic downturn, the government has a role to essentially try and lift up the economic system. And the way that they chose to do that after the 2008 financial crisis in most wealthy countries was through a process that eventually came to be summarized as quantitative easing.
Absolutely.
But what that meant, I mean, there's many different ways of a government supporting an economy. One of them that is not such a bad idea is just to give people at the bottom of the economy money, to hand them cash. But that's not what they did. Essentially what they did is they permitted banks to make loans where the risk would be taken by the state. And that, the short form of that is to say that they were allowed to print money. So the bank was basically allowed to just materialize more money in digital accounts, and then say, like Mark, let's say that you're you're a business here, big business, not a small business, but a big business. You could then go to the bank, and because the bank is allowed to essentially say, we have an extra $5 million to lend you because we say so, the bank is much more likely to give you a loan for, let's say, a riskier business venture than it would be if they weren't allowed to just make the money, and if that risk wasn't just being taken on by the state. So the effect was to print money, yes, in a certain way, but print money in a digital age, first of all, and second of all, to print money but only distribute it to the institutions at the very, very top of the economy, those who deal very directly with central banks, which is to say, like, the large commercial and investment banks in society. So you essentially had the way that the global economic elite chose to deal with the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath was to bail out the top part of the economy with the understanding that this was supposed to kind of trickle down. It didn't. Yeah, the rich got richer. Surprise, surprise. The middle class shrank. Or the number of so-called high net worth individuals grew, actually, because there was a greater disparity between rich and poor. I will say that one of the beneficiaries of that was the art market, because when the high net worth individual pool grows, even if they're taking money from the bottom of society, there's a better market for art. So there were some good years.
Absolutely.
Fortunately, most of the people I wrote about, I suspect you didn't really benefit very much, but...
No, I don't. I've said this. So then also, I don't engage with this is really important since 2005, because I realized I couldn't critique capital and then commodify it. So I don't, this is really important to say, so the work is not for sale in that regard. This was a decision that had to be made, because otherwise it would undermine the argument. One could argue, I can't take a position and then say, I want to break. One could argue this is what has got us where we are. But that was a decision, and that's not a decision for everybody. I would just say, yeah, the quantitative easing is very important, though, I think, in terms of realizing where we are. So in the last decade, they've pumped in $10 trillion around the world, and this is Federal Reserve, Swiss National Bank, European Central Bank, People's Bank in China. They're all at it in terms of actually who is able to turn that debt they have in their books, turn into a bond, ECB, for example, which is the central bank for the citizens of the European Union. And then they give them their money for these bonds. And why that's really important is that, for giving you an example, right today, this last week, the Bank of England, who's been talking about austerity, because one could argue even rising interest rates, you're actually forming another form of austerity, because who will suffer most from high interest rates is actually generally the normal citizen. Let's talk about the 99%. And so with this last week, in one day, the Bank of England pumped in £65 billion sterling of citizens' money to uphold, which is part of the bond market guilt. That's really important, because there are a lot of communities saying, why can't we get funding? No, we don't have the money, we don't have the money, but then the money is there. And I think that what it shows is that there are models. I mean, there's a low discussion and theorizing around this, but when it's necessary, there's a very lovely, best word in Kreuzberg of graffiti on a building across from the Hermann Hesse Grundschule. And it says, you know, if the world was a bank, she'd already be saved. And so we must remember in 2008, in one week, they saved the global financial system. And basically through this process, as Mario Draghi famously said, whatever it takes. And they're still talking about whatever it takes. And so that's led to, when I started this project, inequality in the world was the widest since the Second World War. And now even the people who run Davos, the World Economic Forum, now point that inequality in the world is the widest in the history of the planet. And that's from the people who organize Davos in Switzerland every year. So this is where this has shifted in terms of the discussions, research around this system. Because we're in Germany, if I may show you, because there's a lot of talk about the wealth in Germany, Misha's seen this one already. If we were to look at the wealth in Germany today, and we look at this A4 piece of paper, this is about 80% of the wealth in Germany. This is about 90% of the wealth in Germany. 5 years ago, if I was to get the top part of the wealth, I would go 32 kilometers into the air. Now it's 64 kilometers into the air. So the disparity between, so in the former West, I think 50% of people working in the former West today only do so without contract. I think 67% in the former East. So that notions of vulnerabilities, precariousness, in response to this systemic, structural picture. These are the implications of that. I think sometimes it helps to visualize the disparities in which we find ourselves. So Quant AD, I think, is also too, is funded in terms of the buying up the financialization of our cities, so commodifying where we can't find homes. Speculators with low interest rates were looking for returns, so they buy up city blocks, city quarters, also using quantitative easing, because you can turn that debt into a bond, the ECB will buy it. So the thing where we can't find a home, this is part of that system. They also sit vacant, because it's easier for them to sit vacant and they appreciate value than actually to get a tenant in and actually pay rent, because that might actually cost you more. And this is happening across the globe. So this process and that relationship to these actual systems is very important. And then when one looks at the advisory panel to the ECB, I think there's something about 150 advisors that work in global finance, and I think 5 that represent citizens' interests. So if we think who sits at the table about advising policy, sorry, it's not to labour the point, but I think it's an understanding of
these illustration, yeah.
The other key word I just wanted to, just at time, is that notion of capital's relationship, because this is when we think about what we do in terms of our practices, about trying to understand, to represent, how do we represent these systems, and I'm thinking also about the work you've written about, the artists you've written about. I was also thinking about Leigh Claire's the notion of abstraction. She also talks about complexity, how that's used as a strategy in the context of concreteness. I don't know if there's anything you can say to that, Max, in terms of thinking about those sort of, what your experiences has been in terms of sort of, I suppose, representing these systems. Or what the challenges are, or strategies.
Well, I think one of the contradictions that we're faced with when we try and describe the system or represent the system, whether we're trying to represent it through words, like we are right now, or trying to represent it through images, is that actually capital is itself a kind of weaponized form of representation. So not to go too deep into the weeds, but like this thing we call capitalism, or this thing we call capital, this force of money moving around the world, is trying to represent something. It's always trying to represent the capacity of the humanity that it dominates to produce. And by produce, I mean just like make life together. Capital, like the money that circulates around the world, alleges itself to be a representation of actual real world value. And there's a kind of unclosable gap because, of course, the real world of complexity of what it means to be human and to cooperate as a cooperative species is sublime, to use that kind of older language. It's beyond the scope of the imagination. And yet capitalism as a system is constantly called to try and imagine it. And I think there's the field of economics, which is tasked with imagining and creating a functional imaginary model of what society looks like, and then giving policymakers and economic actors the tools to act upon that representation. In the same way that in an older age, the imperial cartographers would be tasked with making a map of a territory that an empire wished to dominate. But the difference is that in the old model of creating a map of a territory, the map doesn't necessarily change the territory. I mean, maybe the war will change the territory, it'll change the topography of the area being invaded. They'll cut down the forests, they'll dig ditches, they'll destroy, the area, the natural and human-made parts of the area. But under this regime of capitalism, and I think increasingly in an age of financialization, the cognitive and economic models we create are a form of what Brian Mussolini calls ontopower. They actually transform the territory that they're seeking to read. There's other people who've kind of made this point using different terminologies, but I think it's a very unique question around representation, because the field of economics, just as the kind of the crown science of capitalism, is not simply saying, well, this is the way things lie and this is how we should act. The actions that it promotes and provokes then transform the economy, which itself is a kind of transformation of the underlying society. But that's one level of how a field that is tasked with representing then has a certain kind of power. But there's another layer of abstraction to this as well, which is this thing we call money, the thing we call capital, that thing which is acting in the world that economics is seeking to measure and narrate and map. That's also trying to, in a certain kind of way, in an inhuman way, that force, that metahuman force is trying to understand society and to affect it. Just to go to the level of metaphor for a moment, David Harvey, the famous Marxist geographer, talks about the financial sector as the central nervous system of the capitalist system. In the sense that what happens in a financial system is, like in a body, you have price signals that come in from all around the world, through the kind of tectonics of markets, that then filter up to the central nervous system and then trigger certain kinds of actions, and then those actions are sent back out to markets through this kind of electrical metaphor. I've suggested that maybe the imagination is a better metaphor than the central nervous system, because central nervous system would imply that it's rational, or that it makes sense. And it doesn't. And would suggest that there's an actual kind of like almost biomechanical dimension, where I think actually what's going on is, as you were pointing out earlier, far more cultural, far more, we need more anthropological language to describe it. But this is all to say that there's these multiple layers whereby capital and capitalist sciences are trying to measure and understand the world to affect it. And I think that presents certain problems to how we can represent it, those of us who are not part of those official sciences of economics, but trying and understand capitalism from a human and ecological perspective, or trying to represent it so that we can see it. And I think in short, what it leads to is a certain kind of short circuit, that there's a certain opacity to the market and to our ability to describe it. We can only ever describe it partially, because because capitalism makes itself into a totality. It begins to, in that way we were talking about financialization before, it begins to reshape everything. And so you can't necessarily, you can't take a photograph of capital. There's no possibility that it will ever appear as an image. And I, despite my efforts and having written several books, I'm never going to be able to describe it completely. Marx's very impressive 3-volume Capital, even if he'd completed it up to his fabled volume 5 or 6, would have not actually been able to describe it. And you can tell it at work in that text. He's really always struggling. He keeps on coming at it from a new angle and trying to describe it, and you're like, why is he doing this? It's because the thing is almost too big. Because it is us. It is what we are becoming, or what we are being made to become.
Because that's one, there's a couple things, but the first thing is, I think, because Mark, he said that capitalism is everything to be represented in its image.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of is what Karen O talked about, her essential argument is, having been an investment banker, that Wall Street seeks corporate America to be reflected in its image, to be remade in its image. And so this has been also a central theme in this, is actually how that process that we are saying become financialized, that actually the system itself, and that's why the culture is important, seeks to be recreated in its image. And the possibility in some ways of, okay, do you want to?
No, I'm fine. It's from a cold I had like 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I've just got this debris in my lungs. I'm not contagious.
But so with that in mind, in terms of, because it would be my position, and sort of then in that context, then to come to that thing about, because that was we were thinking of a title today about, and it was coming back to your idea of a radical imagination. I was wondering if you could think about, because if we know these things now, Canada, there was a story of where a young Iroquois man in now what is now present day Quebec was brought into an English court as they fought the French over that part of eastern Canada, as it was known then. And it was the latter part of the 19th century. And of course, being an English court, he was supposed to put his hand on the Bible to swear the truth, the whole truth, etc. And he said, I can't tell you the truth, only what I know. So in this of what only I know, in terms of thinking about, your idea within of the radical imagination, if we know the unsustainability of the system, the role of something like the radical imagination in terms of how we say a little bit, so I know this is vast, so it's hard for me, and we're not going to answer the problems of work in an hour. But maybe just about about that idea of the radical imagination.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when I started working on it about the same time as I was starting to work on financialization, and the two projects were kind of paired. Because on the one hand, I was trying to understand, with financialization, how capitalism captures, or conscripts is maybe a better word, the imagination. In the sense that each of us, to the extent that we imagine ourselves as a kind of miniature financier, as we talk about everything in our life as investments, it's like our imagination is being recruited to become part of that system, and through that we contribute to the reproduction of that system. So the flip side of that was to then study the radical imagination and study the radical imagination of social movements, and how and when it feels like people are able to imagine that the world could be different, and that your actions could bring about a different world. So we took the term, the term's been thrown around by a lot of different people. We took our definition of the term mostly from the French-Greek theorist Cornelius Castoriadis. It was a very big influence on young people who would eventually be part of the 1968 uprisings in Paris. He's not as well remembered now as some of the other sort of French theorists who've risen to prominence, but he was a sort of dissident Marxist and eventually sort of psychoanalyst. And what's interesting about his idea of the radical imagination is he means radical not in a kind of like normative sense, so it's not a value judgment, it's actually about like a type of imagination that's at the root. It goes back to that kind of Latin root of the word radical, the roots of a tree, radices. And he was thinking about the radical imagination as this kind of tectonic, volcanic force. He likens it to magma, that is underneath the surface of the earth. That's present in all of us, in all of our sort of psyches, and then also present in society. And in fact, it's something that connects the individual psyche to society. And for him, all the institutions of society and all our senses of identity and almost everything we know in the world is a solidification of the imagination. He likens it to this magma, this sort of molten rock that's under the surface of the planet that erupts to the surface and then hardens into a form. And we see the form and we imagine that things have always been like that. So we see the institution of, let's say, police. And we're like, oh, there must have always been police. Well, no, there wasn't. They're 150 years old. It was imposed at the barrel of a gun. They're there to enforce class war. That's the truth about the police. But we imagine there must have always been police, right? So that's that something emerged. We decided that some humans should get to go around armed and lock each other in jail and have complete impunity to do what they want. We call those people police. That's an institution of society that's formed out of how we collectively imagine what it means to live together and cooperate and what we need to do that. Castoriadis' argument is that the institution of marriage, the institution of housing, the institution of education, the institution of police, all of these social institutions are formations of the imagination. And at various points in society, that imagination erupts again. And like a volcano, the magma spews everywhere, a new formation forms, it cools. And for him, this was a kind of continuous process. Although he was also, believed in social change. So his curiosity was always, how do you cultivate the radical imagination? How do you direct the flows of these magmas so that it isn't just a kind of accidental process? What happens in those revolutionary situations where for a moment the reigning order, that kind of field of statues, is swept away? And so we took that up and used it as a way of thinking about how social movements keep hope alive in dark times. We studied social movements in a small Canadian city where there was like very little hope that they would ever succeed, and everyone admitted that. We were interested in how social movements persist amidst perpetual failure, and why that might still be important in some way. Yeah, and so that's kind of how we ended up using that term. And it's proven quite useful.
And it's, I think, like we're sitting here today and we've planned this a long time, and as we speak, there are tens of thousands of people walking on the streets of this city. One in support of women in Iran, as we speak, and also against this so-called, there is a cost of living crisis, but the idea that this term has been used also to, it's the cost of living, it's over there, it's over there, it's not us.
Yeah.
In terms of this system, right? So
it's an act of God.
It's
yeah.
an act
Cost
of God.
living.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so just in terms of thinking of that, like if we think about some of those movements and actually, you know, what is, you feel this groundswell, there's an awareness. I think there's also a jittering on a national state level about they're aware of what the price could be. I'm conscious we're in the 20s again. 100 years ago. This is also where I come from Ireland. This was also a very divisive time, based also around inequality, poverty, oppression. So just in terms, I think there's very much an awareness. It's tangible across the globe that there's. One doesn't want to get this. I mean, do I mention this now? Maybe I do. I mentioned this to Misha. So 3 days ago, I saw a slide shared by a financier at a conference, in which they're already pricing in, you know, the death of 2 or 3 billion people in the next 20 years. So the financial system is pricing in, you know, the expendability of that amount of people because of the climate catastrophe. So the logic of a system, such a bloody logic, in the context of that, then the urgency around the idea of the radical imagination. Do you see that as essential?
I do.
Like, what's to be done?
Don't ask me that. No, I think it is important. And I think what happens is as people, like, the radical imagination, what we theorize in that book is that the radical imagination isn't something that an individual has. It's not like something you or I have. It's something that we do together. So in a weird way, we're doing it like when we come to forums like this and we talk about important issues and our imaginations expand, and they expand together in dialogue and debate and discussion. But also I think the radical imagination expands when people act and when they defy the powers that be, when they refuse to accept the institutions of society as eternal and normal, when they refuse this kind of normalization of deviance you were talking about before. That said, we would be foolhardy to imagine that that only goes one direction. You know, and what we're seeing very worryingly, I think, in the last 10 years, and increasingly in an accelerating way, is that now it's widely admitted, like by these financiers, that we're, you know, to use the technical term, fucked. And there are score. And there's a bunch of people proposing different causes and different solutions. And I think the risk is always that people who provide easy solutions and solutions that make people feel good about themselves have a much easier time recruiting people. People who want to say that the reasons and the solutions are complex and that they might not make us feel good about ourselves have a very big uphill battle. And unfortunately, I'm on that side.
There is a price. I mean, we talk about this, right? More recently, I mean, we turn to ideas of direct action, and that this role, the idea of direct action, which actually in some ways came out also out of liberation theology. Like this was in Central America too, was very prevalent in the 16th century. Heavily informed theology informed. I need to be as a post-Catholic coming from Ireland, non-believer, but this idea of a Marxist theology, right? That this notion that actually direct action with love, so you know, in terms of actions, in terms of against particular apparatus and infrastructure. You know, I had an uncle who was at the time an Irish Roman Catholic priest in South Africa who was involved in such actions as a Catholic priest, because this was seen as the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. So you know, one, and I think that idea of the moving of the paradigm. So I was asked to present at a conference on international finance in Ljubljana in Slovenia in 2015, and you had in the room Federal Reserve, ECB, all these people to talk about this project. But at the end was one of the great questions where a professor of economics said to me, Mark, if we are asked, if we are paid to write a report, you know, do we write what we think, or do we write what they want to, what they want us to think? Exactly. So this sort of, so the shift in the paradigm, that this was, to use the parlance, skin in the game, and actually the need to move the paradigm. Also as citizens, that actually, you know, you mentioned this because this is the thing, it's not going to be easy. There's a price in terms of, I've been curious about this in terms of, because we've been sold the idea of career. So originally, some of our sons, you know, a meeting, Elton happened, and you know, they're talking career guidance about where this is going to go for your son, and there's ideas and possibilities. And when you study a long time, the sort of critical questions about this idea of career, and or enculturing, when we know it's a system, or to join a ship that we know where it's headed. So what is the price to, I mean, this is a very big question, but you mentioned this because I agree with the price for us all. Yeah. Because obviously there's a bigger price in terms of not doing anything, but also the price of shifting that. Yeah. Shifting our way of life, shifting our...
I think it's going to be a huge shift. Yeah. I mean, but the shift is coming whether we want it or not. It's just a question of how much control we want to have over that shift. Yeah. I mean, the cost of living crisis is basically code word for the euthanization of the middle class. The recognition that the capitalist class no longer needs an intermediary. You know, it no longer needs to maintain a large swath of the population in a kind of comfortable complicity. You know, that's bad for culture because middle class angst has given us many wonderful novels and artworks, but you know, like, but for capital, I think they're shrugging off their need for that. So, like, that's changing, and I think what we're seeing is a huge amount of fascist and reactionary anger from the downwardly mobile middle classes, often articulated around ideas of like white supremacy and racism. And so it's imperative that not only do we say like, no, we're not accepting a world where corporations just rule everything, but also we're saying like, well, what kind of life do we want to live? Yeah. Like, do we just want to go back to the like career, you know, let's have a house, let's like, you know, have shopping. Yeah. I mean, if that's what we want, then we have to admit there was never the possibility that that was going to be globalized, right? That was only ever going to be on offer for what is essentially a single-digit percentage of the global population, disproportionately white, most of them living in formerly imperialist nations. So we're not, like, there's not really an option of just going back to a global middle class without the perpetuation of essentially global systems of heinous exploitation. Exactly. So something is shifting. Like, by the end of our, you know, hopefully we all live a long natural life, by the end of our life, the class dynamics of capitalism will change radically. I think part of the radical imagination is not just saying, like, what are we going to sit around and think about, but, like, how are we actually going to practice politics differently? How are we going to practice life differently? How are we going to practice mutual aid? And all of those things are becoming much more urgent as the cost of living increases, as the energy runs out, as crop failures continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Because even where I'm from, there's somewhere, because we could dismantle green capitalism, we could debt, but I am conscious of being I appreciate everybody's patience listening to, but I'm hoping, but thank you, and I'm hoping that there may be some questions or thoughts or observations. I mean, this is that people may have talking it out. Who has any questions or just want to escape?
Well, I would have a question because I was watching on the archive of the Transmediale 2018. There was a panel with you two, and it was this moment somebody from the audience said, like, so what are you gonna do, like, about all this mess? And you were smiling, and then you were saying, like, well, you don't know would work and what would not work. But for me, my question to you is like, I mean, I guess you are practicing this radical imagination and you're thinking that way. Is there something personal outcome for you? Like something where you kind of shifted already your ways of life or, you know?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Let's see. Yes, in some ways. Are you asking like about like, about like kind of a biographical question about what I'm doing? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying in various ways, and I've been part of a number of different attempts to collectivize life in different ways. I lived for many years in a housing co-op. I worked quite extensively when I was in Thunder Bay with indigenous-led activism around trying to produce forms of community safety outside of police and prisons. So with the kind of abolitionist politics. I've recently been like traveling a lot and moving, and before that the pandemic. So I feel like recently I haven't been as involved in those initiatives as I have in the past. And I'm at a moment of curiosity about what the future holds for my particular life and practice. It's something I think about a lot. I mean, I'm very fortunate in the sense that I have a permanent academic job that's like quite comfortable. So I'm not being forced into those positions yet. So it's all voluntary. And that has, I mean, for me that's great. But it's not common, I think. So I think about it a lot, and I think about it a lot also as I get older and have different kinds of needs. I think the things that made sense to me when I was younger are shifting in some ways. I find it harder to live collectively. I actually was part of a collective living experiment from January until August. That was a kind of interesting communalist effort. It didn't work. So I think a lot about those things, but maybe the one thing I would say about it is I feel we're now looking for what Rodrigo Nunes has called a kind of diagonalism, which is like, I think at an earlier moment for me, I was really interested in kind of horizontalism, building the commons from below, trying to create new forms of life, new forms of mutual aid, new forms of solidarity, new ways of practicing the radical imagination. I think increasingly, I'm interested in how that then combines with a more, what we might imagine to be a sort of more traditional politics of demand, of trying to come up with plans, of actually trying to imagine and begin to put in place the structures of a new economy now. I think there's a lot of really interesting experiments going on with that around the world. Like I think especially during the pandemic, interestingly, people had to figure out new ways of living together, or they chose to. So I've heard since the pandemic changed into whatever phase of the pandemic we're in now, I've heard of dozens of projects of people getting property somewhere or taking over property and starting to manage it and live in it in sort of new ways, trying to practice family in different ways, trying to practice education in different ways. I think there's a proliferation of small experiments. But the question is, I mean, can those small experiments, can they mutiny together? I don't know.
Are we tolerant? I mean, I think also you've been hearing the talk, but I also think of Athens, right? The part at the time, you know, I mean, Varoufakis, the former minister, describes it as the debtor's prison, you know, and it has been. And just what was possible at those particular times where you had community health centres, community water that were run by the community in that sort of ways, that were actually sustainable. But obviously then that capital goes, we can't have this anymore, so we send in the police force to break up those possibilities, also working with people seeking refuge and sort of co-op, you know, and seeking those possibilities. And I'm also conscious of where we are, because I have to be, because we're in the former East Berlin, and we're in the former East, and one would argue the first neoliberalized state, one of the first in the world. And you know, I'm conscious of where we are too structurally. I have to include this because I'm an Irishman, as a Canadian, and we're sitting in the corner of a building talking about these things that even today, there's a wonderful website on MDR, Wem gehört der Osten. And so today, you know, only 4% of the most powerful positions in the former East are held by people from East Germany. So structurally, in terms of thinking about Harvey talks about the neo-colonizing powers of global capital and globalization, that when we think about that's structural. Now imagine if I was in West Germany, we had a conversation about this, Misha, that, you know, and only 4% of the most powerful positions in the former West Germany were held by West Germans. I think there'd be a discussion going on. There'd be questions being asked. So what we see here is, and actually what the parallels there, what I mentioned Greece also, was that the discussions we saw in 2015 mimicked the discussions that went on between the former West Germany and East Germany at that time in the negotiations. And also how the railroading of those negotiations and actually the selling off of state assets. So also a template at that time, because if we think about this moment in history of 1989, 1990, and where we find ourselves now in the process of financialization, because within 2 months of the wall coming down, Potsdamer Platz was privatized. It was bought by hedge funds, and it was sold on the global market. So this sort of process almost began, and I walk through that space all the time, and you look for some semblance of history. Now there's one plinth to Carl Liebknecht, and that's kind of the, to use a Barthes term, the punctum in the whole scene.
But no statue.
That's it, and there's no statue.
Yeah.
And so sometimes wonders about that. But that moment when they begin with the walk, because people were walking out into this notion in another way, those negotiations and how that sort of the template of those processes. So as we sit here in Berlin, there's a department in the Bundesregierung that are still selling off the assets of the former East. Now, I'm not trying to right or wrong or argue for it. That's not my argument here in terms of the rights and wrongs that if I look out the end of the street and what I see the entrance to here, that's not my point. The point is about the structures of these systems and how they're replicated, and how that was replicated in 2015, as they were saying, Greece, give us our money. Well, you know, the Netherlands, this is why Dijsselbloem was up here in the algorithms in this soundscape. He was saying, give us our money, representing the Eurozone group, while he had set up a shadow banking system with, what's his name, the former EU president in Luxembourg and in my native country, where most of that money was flowing out of. So that idea of these sort of process saying, you know, you will do this while we've got you under the cosh, and actually how this mimicked also those negotiations, and we need to acknowledge where we're sitting as part of this process, right? The site becomes important, and the questions that are still not asked, and seeing that also as part of what they call it, like the second gold rush. Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge where we also are. That was important today. So, are there any other questions? Misha, that answered to that?
Yeah.
Anybody else? It can also be that, you know, we don't agree with you, you're full of absolute, this is bullshit. This is okay too, yeah, that's discourse.
We can also all get a drink and
we can also
discuss
get a drink.
later.
There's no question, is there a question?
Well,
Yeah.
Robert.
I just had I've been listening and absorbing this very intellectual and academic line of reasoning, thinking, talking. I wanted to ask how biology plays into this, because the premise, some of the premises you're talking about, biology could have a bigger effect on that. Like, I mean, in a very sort of non-specific way. I mean, why should we all continue living? Why should humankind continue on this planet? So your premise is based that it should get, I mean, from what I'm hearing, I think, that we want a more equal system and a better system and a system that serves all. But also we've done, through history, as you've pointed out, and continual repetition of history, we've pretty much destroyed most things. So why should we as a species continue? Why should we be so concerned? Why shouldn't we just die out? Or does biology play into your thinking in this? I guess I'm not quite sure how the question is formed, but
Why should we survive?
Yeah. Well, why should we survive?
Yeah.
I mean, other species on the planet who you know, for whatever reasons, did not survive. Why should the one that's existing now keep going?
Yeah.
I know it's very pessimistic to you. I'm just putting it out.
There's a George Carlin clip This very question, George Carlin on YouTube, you know.
I can imagine that.
No, it's sort of.
I don't know. I mean, I'm curious who we ask the question to. Like, are we asking the question to ourselves? Are we asking the question to God, to the cosmos? I mean, maybe, but like, who's the adjudicator of if we should survive? I think humans, most of us want to. And we've done some pretty incredible things in our somewhat destructive time on this planet, and I think we're probably capable of doing pretty amazing things. I also, like, I am an analyst mostly of power, so my narratives of human history are about the exercises of power. But I actually think that for most of our history, I think we have a high capacity for violence as a species, and violence against one another, and murderous violence at that, which is quite unique among other animals. But at the same time, I think like most of our lives and most of the relationships that we have in our lives are not particularly violent. And I do actually believe we could live in a fairly decent, I don't think it would be perfect, but a fairly decent society that didn't involve us committing constant acts of violence to ourselves and others on the planet. I do fundamentally believe that. And, you know, I'm trained as, and I've chosen to live my life as a humanist. Like, I study the humanities, I teach literature. And so I think we do some pretty cool stuff sometimes. We make nice things. And surely we deserve to survive because of that. I mean, maybe that's just human narcissism, but ultimately, I don't know. I don't know if we ever get to have our moment in court with some higher power, where we get to say, well, on the balance, we deserve to live or not. Ultimately, I think the problem is that we're, and maybe to return us to a bit more the realms of political and less speculative, I think the question you're asking is being asked in big ways, and we do need to ask it, because right now that question is actually being asked by the dark Enlightenment scumbags of Silicon Valley, who basically decided that 3 to 4 billion people are just to use Harari's terms, useless people, or to use Marx's terminology, which he was using derisively, surplus populations, right? Like, they've kind of decided, I mean, there's a whole group of people who are designing the technologies we use every day, like the social media we use, who fundamentally believe that humans will be and should be replaced by cyborg hybrids, their idea of this sort of singularity. So like these big questions about humanity, I mean, they're kind of philosophical on some level, but they're also very practical because people with a lot of power are thinking about them. There's people who believe that what would be great for humanity is for 90% of it to die off and the rest to go into space.
This got me into a lot of trouble. I'm now this is going to be recorded. I remember in 2015, I can't believe I said it, but the first thing is, I think if you look, I always look at, you want to see the future capital, look at a trading floor. So this famous photograph by Andreas Gorski in 1999, the Chicago Board of Trade, 10,000 traders were in that space in 1999. Today there are about 350, and it's all like in Deutsche Börse, it's the TV studio, they're media people and so forth. So one could argue in the dystopian view, and this is what I try to resist, because we are part of a community, and I do, it's something I think about. You should see the Carlin piece. I'm going to send it to you, Robert. But just the, because actually how that's instrumentalized. And I think both I'm part of a community as a citizen, I would agree, as a humanist, but we're here. And there's a responsibility to that wider community, and call that a moral imperative. And a responsibility. And so I would argue financial capital, in seeking everything to be recreated in its image, is also about a large case of peoplelessness. And that's also why the question of representation remains important. There's a lot of discussion of post-representation. But actually I would argue in that abstraction, that removal to make it disappear, that only plays into actually the aspirations of this system and its momentum and its culture. And so it's a response. So if and so to in some ways to challenge that, I think that's why representation actually remains important. The politics of it, the political ethical imperative remains important, and to sort of rail against the system, because what we've witnessed is, yes, this has contributed to our history, but what we've seen is a ramping up that's never been witnessed. So the inequality 10 years ago was the widest since the Second World War, and now it's the widest in the history of the planet. So the structure of this system, the momentum of this system, is actually in some ways ultimately will not discriminate also. People higher up may get a little bit more time. But also to sort of is aware of this, the sort of even to forecast that this amount of people, this is actually, all one could argue, is the aspiration. It's the sort of the few you look at the trading for, because this is what this is include, because already in Alice they've moved onto online, right? So there's no more open outcry, and the idea of the open outcry, the poetics of open outcry to rail against. This is why this is important. So I think, absolutely, I think philosophically, biologically, understand, but as a member of this, we have to, in some ways, because really the clock is ticking. I always see that, the clock is ticking in terms of maybe this talk of 2, 3, 4 years at the moment is critical, the next 3, 4 years, the decade for sure. You mentioned earlier about the sort of dystopic. So if you go read the Twitter feed of Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, not known for being an outright Marxist, left-wing, whatever, but even 2, 3 weeks ago as he visited Pakistan, he said he described it as communal suicide. So for the UN General Secretary, to somehow or another, and it's been ignored primarily by the media, the power elites who sort of, right, here's a fracking license, here's a whatever. And actually to talk in those terms is actually the sort of seriousness of where we find ourselves. And so I'm going off on a tangent, sorry Rob, in terms of the question, but in terms of the impetus, in terms of the sort of the 10,000 traders, I'm not arguing for 10,000 traders again, that's not my point here. It's actually about the structure, the culture of financial capital and where it sees itself, because it already is stateless. Right? This is the point of the nation state. It's a front, it uses it, it's got it in its pocket. So in some ways it's already achieved that. It sets up in countries like where I'm from, as a tax haven, which the Republic of Ireland is, as much as they'll try to talk about tax compliance and complicity. But it's part of that infrastructure. And that's actually denying funds to the global south, to other countries because of the tax avoidance. It's extraordinary. So within that it's actually the necessity in some ways to, and you know, on a personal level, because I've got kids, and you know, it's what Baldwin said, right? He said, we're just trying to save our children, right? So that's 1974, it's almost 50 years ago in Berkeley. So part of it, the heart of it now for me in some ways is because you've got also kids and, you know, whatever, these sort of things, that actually this sort of system, in terms of where it's going and the implications of. I mean, I did a talk in Paris in 2014, this will take 2 lines. We made a presentation, we talked about the only moment that matters in financial capital is now. Is now. I think in 1945, the average stock in the US was held for 6 years. In 2000, it was 6 months. By 2014, it's something like 12 seconds. So the only thing that something is held for is the now. And so after this, a woman, an Irish-born woman, a trader on a trading floor in an American bank, a US-based owned bank in Paris, came up and said, you know, I'm in my 30s, I want to have children, but I know where the world is going, so I'm not sure I can. So within this system, it's like these sort of narratives. So that's it, really.
I have a question.
Please.
You give quite an interesting perspective on AI throughout the show, the soundtrack, and then the video piece there is give an interesting view on sort of like how the hyper-optimization of AI is sort of becoming meaningless, and it's sort of like digging in the weeds, and it's sort of like the optimization of it has gone past human needs. It's just now almost fulfilling itself, its own sort of fantasy of the AI to optimize itself further. So my sort of question is, do you see any sort of benefit or any way that AI could benefit?
Well, it's a really good question, because this is one you've got to be, it's like, personally I find work important, because it gives value. Sometimes we can come to it depending on what that is. The value of working in a communal space, the social interactions, and so forth. So when it comes to, I always think of AI, I don't see the notion of artificial intelligence, I always still talk about algorithmic intelligence. This was the term that I would use, because I think it's more appropriate. It also alerts us to its constructiveness, and that's important, because an idea of AI is is some sort of ghost off in the machine that somehow or another will be beyond our ability to control and so forth. And I think that's important to hold on to that. In that context, I think there can be, absolutely, in terms of the possibilities, because its ability to take in large value out or whatever and so forth. There are potentials. However, within the culture of system, which in some ways builds it, speculates upon it, invests in it in its current form, I think that potential still seems rather very small compared to the implications on our lives in terms of what's currently the infrastructure that sort of frames our lives, that is part of our lives, that is on us at the moment. This is a whole discussion about becoming data. We're not even no longer the consumer and so forth, we are actually the commodity. It's part of financialization too, this discussion about actually how we are datafied. We didn't even get to talk about gamified, gamified capital, but all these terms. There are potentials for sure, obviously, but my reservation about it is in its current form, with the interests at play. I think a lot of people have looked at Ridley Scott's film.
Blade Runner?
Blade Runner. And somehow they want to make it reality, you know? It's kind of this sort of, they think this is aspirational, and he wasn't painting, or was, Philip K. Dick trying to paint it as aspirational. So that would be my response. I think it's potentials, but I think, unfortunately, I don't know if that answers. I don't know what you think.
Do you think it's too deep, because essentially it needs to be experimented with to try, you need to experiment certain models to try and get this result, right?
Sure.
So to experiment with it means to experiment with this system that's in such controlled by, it's such an important system, the thing that regulates the AI that regulates global trade. How are people going to get into it to experiment with it?
Because it's not overseen. This is also Karen O. She talks about even when they were introducing products. So even with, say, going back to derivative trading, if you try to get somebody who understands what that meant at the time. Well, the guy's in New York at the moment, he's not here in the office, and that's the only person that knows. So and then they would add layers of complexity, and really very few people know, actually. And this is an limit also in these systems, that actually those layers of complexity are added, and as you rightly said, it becomes so enrooted on us, in us. We are it in some ways, and of course it brings all those images that like the Matrix and so forth. That I don't what's the word? Sorry, I'm forgetting words. In some way endorse, because it also creates this a mythical notion of the. But in terms of it's a space of speculation, because remember that's what it is. It's ultimately about a space of speculation, but also profit generation, and that's its prime motivation. I think there's all these little narratives, whatever. The bottom line has always remained the bottom line within these systems. For all the talk of the possibilities and what we're aspiring or hoping to do by certain voices, which I don't even want to name, who've built a rather big factory near us here in Berlin where there's no water and needs lots of water, with huge tax breaks, etc. And only really has ever made profit on Bitcoin. It's buying that narrative. I don't buy the narrative because it sits within this system. It's speculation. I don't know what you think.
No, I think it's the technology has the potential for such greatness of dealing and making sense of large packets of data that humankind just can't see patterns in, because it doesn't look like a face or whatever humans are good at recognizing patterns in. But I think, as you said, it's just the entire system is designed around certain interests of speculation, so to change it is just to yank out the entire system and plop a new one in, which is just too.
It would seem like a rather I should mention too, my brother Ken, designed the algorithm that's when he generated the soundscape. So this is what we did, in terms of, in this case, it's Dijsselbloem, who was the negotiator, the heavy zone, and we downloaded his speeches, his public speeches, and then Ken wrote a piece of code, an algorithm to identify when he used the word market and markets, and then we transformed that data into the soundscape. So when the sound pitches is when you hear the word market. So this was something that was based in reality. He was in a space and used these words, and then actually transformed that to create this soundscape. And so the idea is to represent contemporary financial capital functioning through the conduit, functioning through the nation state. But I think why I mention that also is Ken also uses this code in a health system environment in Ireland, where they do bring in large amounts of data and actually try to analyse it for better well-being in a non-profit system. That's the thing that's very important. So within that, so here's somebody who actually also uses these systems, uses code in terms of actually, as you're saying, in some ways, can analyse large volumes of data for good. For good.
Yeah, if there's still time, so I also have two questions from your talk. So one concerning this image you used of radical imagination, I guess, like this thing bubbling inside the volcano and then erupting, and I'm kind of wondering how much you would like. What is imagination for you? Because when I first heard it, I was kind of struck because it seemed to be not so material, but rather ideal and change. So basically the question is, where do you see change happening? Like where's the point that change is possible? Is it going through ideas, or is change happening through practices, through other things? And if you think imagination will trigger change, then what is imagination? And the other question is concerning maybe revenge. I didn't quite yet, I guess I didn't quite get it, but as you introduced it, maybe you saw revenge as a kind of motivation or something. And yeah, I have to say I kind of disagree. I mean, rage, I would agree, but I guess it would be not so good to, I would, to say rage and revenge is the same thing. Like this is a thing that maybe Aristotle did, right? When he wrote about rage or anger, he equated those two things, but I guess there are other forms of rage that could be possible, and I don't know if you have what really the purpose is of talking of revenge, and also what this relation to from revenge and violence, like how would you relate those two things? Is violence necessary or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
In terms of your first question, I feel like the imagination, I think you're right, the risk about writing. So I come from a background of doing Marxist cultural criticism. So I do it, I'm very bad, and I do the cardinal sin, which is I like to work with idealistic concepts from a materialist perspective. So yeah, you're right, the imagination has been traditionally understood as an ideal and as an idealist rather than a materialist concept. My approach to the imagination, however, I'm always trying to understand it as a force that's actually at work within society and within, like, humans, and at that interface of humans and society. And it's difficult to do because I think the term itself constantly brings us back to idealistic notions. There's no part of the brain that you can cut out that then someone loses their imagination. The imagination in a way, and revenge, I think similarly, both of these are historical discursive formations, in the sense that the very way that we understand what the imagination is or revenge is shaped by the power relations of the society that we're part of. So part of both of the projects on revenge and imagination has been to try and explain how we came to even understand these concepts the way we do, not as sort of eternal forces within the human soul in the idealistic sense, but as a way we create for ourselves for describing something that is otherwise undescribable. So I think about the terms less as describing some fundamental quality and more as tools, that untainted tools. In the same way that like AI, for instance, is a tool, but it's a tool that's been shaped by our society, and so it's not just something that emerges naturally. I think these terms and concepts are also likewise tools of this nature. In terms of your first question about what the point of change is, I think all of the ones you mentioned are points of change. Sometimes discussion is a point of change, sometimes action is a point of change, sometimes solidarity is a point of change, sometimes the art of living is a point of change. I actually think that when, in my studies of the imagination and social movements, what we came to realize is that all of these things are usually in play and they're transforming each other. And you can't actually say what was the one that was kind of, you can sometimes say that some are more important than others or more pivotal than others, but all of them were somehow in interaction in the way that this thing we call the imagination works. And in a way, if you want to flip that on its head, the way of saying it is that the imagination names the interface between individual works of mind, collective conversations, embodied practices, solidarity efforts. It's something that describes the way that all of those things change each other and something new emerges. In terms of revenge, I mean, I agree. I don't think revenge is the same as rage, and I don't think it's the same as violence, although often revenge and a feeling of vengefulness includes a feeling of rage, or they travel together as and I think often revenge, it leads to either violence or to fantasies of violence. But I keep those terms slightly apart. I think for me, revenge is, to quote Baldwin again, he says, revenge is a human dream. And the interesting thing that Baldwin says in dialogue with Orwell is that the moment when you have power to take revenge, it's no longer revenge, it's something else. So revenge has this quality of a feeling that you have when you're powerless to right a wrong, when you're powerless to balance some scales, when you're powerless to achieve justice. And there's something about revenge that's in the waiting, in this kind of interregnum, or in this pause, or in this frustration, that speaks to powerlessness and what happens to us in moments when we feel powerless. So this is why in the book I end up making a distinction between, on the one hand, a revenge fantasy and an avenging imaginary. I think revenge fantasies are really common, and I actually think, I mean, they're ugly. They're not a part of our personality that we particularly like. We don't usually celebrate them, but we all have them. Children have them. And I actually think it's an important part of children growing up to have revenge fantasies. Children are, in most societies, relatively powerless. And injustices happen to them. Maybe they're petty injustices, but injustices happen, and learning to cope with a sense of vengefulness is an important part of being human. I think that sense of vengefulness comes from a sense that things should be fair and it's not fair. And so I think by detaching sort of rage and violence from revenge and trying to really dwell with what revenge is and what it can do, I think something important emerges. And the final thing I'll say about it is, like, I'm not in the book calling for revenge. I am arguing revenge is already here. I'm suggesting that, in fact, revenge has always been at the core of capitalism, and the liberal worldview that attaches itself to capitalism, the kind of normative worldview, wants to insist that capitalism is the only system that's ever existed that banishes revenge. And I think the most clear articulation of this is someone like Hayek. But there's been other people who've written about it in terms of what they call the capitalist peace. But the most recent, I think, popular rendition of this is Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature. There's an argument here that, like, capitalism finally solves the riddle. It finally answers the Sphinx's challenge of revenge, that throughout human history, and in fact this is an argument that they don't properly attribute to Hegel, with the exception of Francis Fukuyama, who does attribute it to Hegel. Throughout human history, it's just been revenge, 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 revenge. That's history, right? The end of history, the neoliberal moment, the capitalism arrives, and it gives us the solution to revenge, because now, instead of competing with one another for and taking justice into our own hands, we can just kind of trust the market and the liberal institutions of society. My argument in the book is that In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's that revenge moves from the level of sort of politics and individuals to the economy, and the economy acts vengefully. And we have to change our definition of revenge slightly, but that's okay because our definition of revenge has already been shaped by this system. So we need to rethink what we mean by revenge to talk less about intentions and more about outcomes. It's not that the capitalism intends to be vengeful, because it's not a person. It doesn't have a personality, it doesn't have a mind. It's a meta-human entity, but its outcome is vengeful. And that's kind of where I end up going with it, to again try and take a materialist account rather than an idealist account. I'm not a philosopher, so I can't actually even do that kind of idealistic work of, or I can only do it very badly.
Thanks.
Well, I'm going to suggest, because we've kind of gone way over, I just want to say, thank you, Max.
Thank
So
you.
we're ready, and I want to say thank you all for sticking around. It's been great. We thought with the day in it, people come, so it's been really great that so many people have. So thank you, and thank you.